A plane crashed with 47 children aboard, leaving families shattered and questions unanswered. But 20 years later, a farmer's dog started digging in a remote field, and what they found changes everything. The morning sun filtered through the gymnasium windows of Westfield Elementary School, casting golden rectangles across the polished floor. Sarah Miller stood at the center of the bustling space, clipboard in hand, her keen eyes surveying the organized chaos around her. 47 children in yellow and blue uniforms darted between duffel bags and backpacks, their distinctive red sneakers squeaking against the floor, each pair bearing handwritten initials in permanent marker. "Josh, make sure your swim cap is in your carry-on, not your checked bag," Sarah called out, making another tick on her checklist. At 32, she carried herself with the poised confidence of the Olympic swimmer she'd almost become, before a shoulder injury redirected her path. This morning marked the culmination of 7 years of work, transforming a failing after-school program into a regional swimming powerhouse. These children from Minneapolis's struggling North Side neighborhoods weren't just going to Portland for a state championship. They were carrying the hopes of an entire community. Sarah touched the small box in her pocket containing her Olympic silver medal, her ritual for important days. The medal represented both her greatest achievement and her greatest disappointment, a constant reminder that success and failure often walked hand in hand. Across town, Jennifer Dawson sat on her son's bunk beds, carefully stitching TD onto one red sneaker and KD onto another. The twins, Tyler and Kevin, bounced around the room, too excited to stand still. "Do you think we'll see mountains from the airplane window?" Tyler asked, packing and repacking his favorite swimsuit for the 4th time. "Definitely," Kevin answered before his mother could. "Dad showed us on the map. We fly right over the Rocky Mountains." Mike Dawson appeared in the doorway, travel itinerary in hand. "Boys, we need to leave in 20 minutes. Double-check your packing lists." Jennifer smiled at her husband, recognizing the slight furrow in his brow, the same expression he wore when reviewing engineering plans at work. "They'll be fine, Mike. Sarah has everything under control." In a small apartment across the neighborhood, Robert Johnson gently braided his daughter's hair, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy. "Daddy, what if the other teams are much better than us?" Alicia asked, clutching her regional competition medal like a talisman. Robert turned his 9-year-old daughter to face him. "Listen to me, Alicia Johnson. You've already won just by making it this far. Whatever happens in Portland, I'm already the proudest dad in Minnesota." The girl's smile revealed a missing front tooth as she threw her arms around her father's neck. 7 years earlier, Sarah had stood at the edge of Westfield's aging pool, watching 3 timid children splash in the shallow end. The school administration had been ready to terminate the swimming program entirely. "Give me 1 year," she'd promised the skeptical principal, "1 year to turn this around." That first year had been a struggle of cold pools, broken equipment, and reluctant participants. But something clicked when Sarah stopped trying to recreate her own competitive swimming experience and instead focused on what these children needed: consistency, encouragement, and the chance to excel at something all their own. The community's fundraising efforts had been nothing short of heroic. Parents who worked multiple jobs still found time to organize bake sales at the community center. Local businesses sponsored car washes in strip mall parking lots. Children set up lemonade stands with hand-painted signs reading, "Send our swimmers to state." Principal Ellen Grady had wept when the final count reached $28,000, enough to send the entire team to Portland. As 7:15 approached, the gymnasium hummed with nervous energy. Parents adjusted backpack straps, gave last-minute reminders about medication and sunscreen, and took countless photos. Sarah observed it all, mentally counting heads for the 20th time. "Everyone with your travel buddies?" she called out. "Remember, no one goes anywhere alone, at any time." Ramon Diaz and Tiffany Wilson, her assistant coaches, moved through the crowd organizing the children into pairs. The 3 volunteer chaperones, Carol Mendez, David Park, and Mike Dawson, distributed pre-packed snacks and water bottles. "Coach Miller," called a small voice. Sarah turned to find Alicia Johnson looking up at her, regional medal hanging prominently around her neck. "We're going to win, aren't we?" Sarah knelt to eye level with the girl. "We've already won just by getting this far," she said, adjusting the swim cap Alicia carried everywhere as her lucky charm. "Everything else is just extra." The yellow school bus pulled away from Westfield Elementary at exactly 7:15, accompanied by cheers and waves from the assembled community. A hastily made banner fluttered in the morning breeze. "Bring home the gold, Westfield Stars." At Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, the children's eyes widened at the vast expanse of the terminal. For many, this was their first time inside an airport, let alone on an airplane. "Everyone together," Sarah called, gathering the team for a group photo. "Form a W with your arms, for Westfield." The children positioned themselves with practiced coordination as David Park snapped the picture with his phone. "Uploading to the school Facebook page," he announced, typing quickly. "Next stop, Portland and Glory. Shuck Westfield Stars." Captain Richard Harmon greeted the group at the boarding gate, his weathered face breaking into a smile beneath his pilot's cap. "Coach Miller," he said, shaking Sarah's hand, "we'll skirt around some turbulence in the Rockies, but nothing to worry about. My crew is ready to give your champions the VIP treatment." The boarding process went smoothly. Children walking in pairs as practiced, some nervous, others barely containing their excitement, all wearing their signature red sneakers. The Embraer ERJ-145, specially chartered for the Westfield team, waited on the tarmac, its blue Northern Skies Airways logo gleaming in the morning sun. As the aircraft took off at 9:23, Jennifer Dawson stood at the terminal window, watching until the plane became a tiny speck against the clear blue Minnesota sky. She clutched the twins' forgotten lunchboxes to her chest, a strange uneasiness settling over her despite the perfect day. While Flight 1742, carrying the hopes of an entire community, disappeared into the horizon, none of the parents waving from the terminal could imagine that this would be the last time they would see their children, or that in exactly 2 hours and 24 minutes, the flight would simply vanish from radar screens over the Rocky Mountains, as if it had never existed. The aircraft climbed steadily into the clear blue sky, carrying 47 excited children and 5 adult chaperones toward what should have been the pinnacle of their young swimming careers. Inside the cabin of Flight 1742, the initial nervousness of takeoff had given way to jubilant chatter as the children settled into their seats. Sarah Miller unbuckled her seatbelt once the captain turned off the sign and began walking down the narrow aisle. "Everyone doing okay?" she asked, smiling at the pairs of travel buddies checking out their complimentary snack packages. "Coach Miller, how long until we see mountains?" asked Tyler Dawson, his face pressed against the small oval window. "About an hour," Sarah replied, ruffling his hair. "Save some of that excitement for when we actually see them." In the cockpit, Captain Richard Harmon and First Officer Jason Meyer were reviewing their flight path. Harmon frowned slightly at the weather radar display. "That system over the Rockies is intensifying faster than forecast," Meyer noted, adjusting some settings. "Denver Center is reporting moderate to severe turbulence at our planned altitude." Harmon studied the colorful display, years of experience evident in his measured response. "Let's request a southern deviation. Might add 15 minutes to our flight time, but better safe than bouncing these kids around." Meyer nodded and reached for the radio to request the course change, but before he could transmit, the screen flickered momentarily. Both men exchanged concerned glances. "Run a quick diagnostic on the weather radar," Harmon instructed, making a notation in his logbook. "Probably just interference, but let's be sure." 11:35. The mood inside the cabin had shifted as the landscape below transformed from flat farmland to the first rippling foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Children who had been playing card games or reading now clustered at the windows, pointing excitedly. "Look at the shadows the clouds make on the mountains," Alicia Johnson exclaimed to her travel buddy. "They look like giants walking." Sarah was distributing snacks when the first jolt of turbulence hit, causing her to stumble slightly. The cabin fell momentarily silent before nervous giggles erupted. "Just a little bumpy air, champions," she called out reassuringly, like diving into a choppy pool, nothing to worry about. Captain Harmon's voice came over the intercom, professional and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some turbulence as we cross the Rocky Mountains. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Attendants, secure the cabin for turbulence." The two flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, checking seatbelts and stowing loose items. Sarah quickly made her way back to her seat, catching Ramon's eye across the aisle. He gave her a reassuring nod, though she noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrest. In the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Multiple warning lights illuminated the instrument panel as the aircraft encountered wind shear much more severe than anticipated. "Denver Center, this is Northern Skies Flight 1742, Meyer called into his headset. "We're experiencing severe turbulence and requesting immediate clearance to descend to flight level 270. The reply came through broken static. "Flight 1742, Denver Center. Cleared to descend to flight level 270. Reports indicate extreme weather activity in your vicinity. Advise your intentions." Harmon wrestled with the controls as the aircraft bucked violently. "Tell them we're deviating south to avoid the cell," he instructed Meyer, his voice tense but controlled. "And run a check on the hydraulic systems. Pressure indicator is fluctuating." The turbulence intensified, sending shock waves through the cabin. Children cried out in fear as the plane dropped suddenly before surging upward again. Sarah began leading them in a team chant, trying to keep panic at bay. "Westfield stars shine bright. Westfield stars show might." The chant caught on, children's voices rising in unison, drowning out their fear with familiar words. In the cockpit, alarms blared as multiple systems began failing simultaneously. Harmon fought to maintain control, while Meyer frantically communicated with air traffic control. "Denver, this is Flight 1742. We're experiencing turbulence severe and—" Meyer's transmission cut off as the aircraft lurched violently. "We're losing stability." Harmon's experienced hands moved across the controls, trying to compensate for the failing hydraulic system. "We're losing altitude," he reported grimly. "Try the backup systems." Meyer's fingers flew across the instrument panel. "Backup hydraulics not responding. Primary electrical system fluctuating." At Westfield Elementary, Principal Ellen Grady was reviewing budget proposals with the district superintendent when her secretary burst into the office, face ashen. "It's about the flight," the secretary said, her voice barely audible. "Northern Skies just called. They've lost contact with Flight 1742. The room seemed to tilt beneath Ellen's feet as the words registered. "What do you mean, lost contact?" In the Denver Air Traffic Control Center, controllers huddled around a radar screen where Flight 1742's transponder signal had been tracking normally until 11:47, when it simply disappeared. "Flight 1742, Denver Center," the controller repeated for the dozenth time, his voice now edged with urgency. "Do you copy? Please respond." Only static answered. Within hours, the gymnasium of Westfield Elementary was transformed into an information center. Tables lined the walls, staffed by airline representatives, police officers, and volunteers manning phones. Parents arrived in waves, confusion giving way to dread as the gravity of the situation became apparent. Jennifer Dawson stumbled through the gym doors, clutching two identical backpacks. "They were so excited they forgot their lunchboxes," she repeated to anyone who would listen, her eyes wide and unfocused. Across the room, Robert Johnson shouted into his cell phone, "What do you mean you don't know where the plane is? It's a commercial aircraft, not a paper airplane." As evening fell, FBI Special Agent Marcus Reynolds arrived with a team of crisis counselors. At 45, Reynolds had handled numerous missing persons cases, but never one involving so many children. His weathered face remained professionally composed as he assessed the situation. A projector screen was set up at one end of the gymnasium, displaying the official passenger manifest. As each name appeared, 47 children and 5 adults. The reality crashed over the assembled families. Sobs and wails echoed through the space once filled with cheers and excitement just that morning. While the families prepared for their first night of vigil in the transformed gymnasium, no one noticed the search and rescue pilot who quietly entered and whispered something in Agent Reynolds' ear. Reynolds' face hardened before he motioned the search coordinators into a private meeting room. The weather conditions in the Rockies weren't just hampering search efforts. They were potentially lethal for any survivors who might be exposed to the elements that night. The weather conditions in the Rockies weren't just hampering search efforts. They were potentially lethal for any survivors who might be exposed to the elements that night. Agent Reynolds glanced at the families huddled in the gymnasium, his throat tight with the knowledge he couldn't yet share. Dawn broke over Westfield Elementary on the second day, pale light filtering through the high windows of the gymnasium where exhausted parents lay on hastily provided cots and sleeping bags. Jennifer Dawson hadn't slept, her eyes red-rimmed as she clutched her son's backpacks against her chest. The twins' forgotten lunchboxes sat beside her, untouched since yesterday morning. In the school's annexed classroom, now converted into the FBI's command center, Reynolds and his team stood before topographical maps of the Rocky Mountains. The senior agent traced a wide circle encompassing nearly 25,000 square kilometers of rugged terrain. "This is our primary search zone based on the last radar contact and radio transmission," he explained to his team. "We're coordinating with the National Guard for aerial sweeps, but the terrain is challenging. Deep valleys, dense forests, sheer cliffs." A knock on the door interrupted the briefing. A liaison from Northern Skies Airways entered, carrying a stack of maintenance logs. "The NTSB wants these reviewed immediately," she said. "They're particularly interested in the hydraulic system reports." By 9 that morning, Reynolds addressed the gathered families in what would become the first of many impromptu press conferences. News cameras had already gathered outside the school, and reporters now filmed from the back of the gymnasium. "We're implementing a comprehensive search pattern within what we call the zone of probability," Reynolds explained, his voice steady despite his fatigue. "This is the area where, based on the aircraft's last known position, speed, and trajectory, we believe it may have gone down." High above the Colorado Rockies, Black Hawk helicopters from the National Guard crisscrossed the search grid. Pilots wearing thermal imaging goggles scanned the landscape below, searching for any heat signature that might indicate survivors. "Sector 7 clear," reported one pilot. "Moving to Sector 8. Visibility improving with the morning sun. But these valleys are deep, could easily miss something if it's under tree cover." Back at the school, volunteers had organized an impressive support system. Tables with food and coffee lined one wall, charging stations for cell phones another, and a quiet area for rest had been set up in adjoining classrooms. Crisis counselors moved among the families, offering what comfort they could. In the maintenance records room, representatives from Northern Skies and NTSB investigators pored over the aircraft's service history. A pattern emerged that sent a chill through the room. The Embraer ERJ-145's hydraulic system had flagged for maintenance 3 times in the past month, but repairs had been deferred each time. They cleared this aircraft to fly with children on board when they knew there were potential issues. An NTSB investigator's voice rose in disbelief. Mike Dawson overheard this exchange as he passed the open door, immediately storming inside. "You're telling me they cut corners on maintenance?" His face flushed with rage as he confronted the airline representative. "You economized on safety, and now my children are paying the price." Security personnel quickly intervened, escorting Mike back to the gymnasium where Jennifer sat motionless, still clutching the backpacks. By late afternoon, a new concern emerged as volunteers monitoring social media reported the first conspiracy theories circulating online. One popular thread suggested the aircraft had been deliberately diverted for nefarious purposes, citing the lack of wreckage as evidence of foul play rather than ongoing search challenges. "We need to address this," Reynolds told his team. "These rumors only add to the family's suffering." As the second day drew to a close, Reynolds gathered the increasingly desperate families. "The storm system has finally moved east," he announced, a flicker of hope in his voice. "We've deployed night search teams with thermal equipment. If there are survivors out there, we will find them." The third day dawned with renewed activity. Specialized teams with search dogs and climbing equipment were airlifted to remote areas of the search grid. Mountaineers scaled steep slopes, calling out and listening for responses that never came. In the teacher's lounge, now serving as a rest area, Robert Johnson convened with several other parents. "We need a formal voice in these search operations," he insisted. "I propose we form a families committee to ensure our concerns are heard." The school grounds had become a media encampment, with news vans from across the country broadcasting live updates. Camera crews filmed family members through the gymnasium windows, prompting volunteers to tape paper over the glass for privacy. Every news report featured Sarah Miller prominently. "The Olympic hopeful who changed lives" read one headline, accompanying footage of Sarah coaching children at the Westfield pool. Her smiling face alongside the team became the image of the tragedy. On CNN, an aviation expert outlined possibilities that families clung to or dreaded. In the case of a controlled emergency landing, survivors could certainly be waiting for rescue, he explained. However, if structural failure occurred during severe turbulence, causing an uncontrolled descent. He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. As evening approached on the third day, Reynolds' face was grave as he called the families together once more. The team of psychologists positioned themselves strategically around the room, preparing for the emotional impact of what he needed to say. "I need to speak with you about realistic expectations at this point," Reynolds began carefully. "After 72 hours in wilderness conditions," while Reynolds was about to continue his somber assessment, indicating that survival chances diminished dramatically after 72 hours, his phone rang, and absolute silence fell over the gymnasium as he answered, his expression shifting as he heard the message. "Confirmed? You're absolutely certain? We're coming immediately." A search team had just located what appeared to be aircraft debris in a remote ravine. The helicopter blades whirred to life in the pre-dawn darkness, stirring the air into a frenzy as Reynolds and a small delegation of family representatives prepared to board. Mike Dawson pulled his jacket tighter against the chill, hope and dread battling within him as he climbed aboard. The National Guard pilot had reported metallic debris reflecting morning sunlight in a narrow ravine approximately 40 miles south of the last radar contact. "We should reach the site in 30 minutes, Reynolds shouted over the rotor noise, his voice carefully neutral. "I need to manage expectations. This could be unrelated debris." Mike nodded mechanically, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first hint of sunrise painted the sky in pale orange. He thought of Jennifer back at the gymnasium, finally asleep after 72 sleepless hours, clutching the twins' backpacks like lifelines. The flight seemed interminable as they passed over increasingly rugged terrain. When the helicopter finally began its descent toward a small clearing, Mike pressed his face against the window, searching desperately for any sign of Flight 1742. Below, search and rescue personnel waved orange markers, guiding them toward a rocky outcropping. A ranger met them as they disembarked, leading the group to a small ravine where sunlight glinted off twisted metal fragments. Mike's heart hammered in his chest as they approached, his mind racing with possibilities, then crashing into despair as the reality became clear. "These are remains from the 1997 crash," the ranger explained to Reynolds, pointing to moss-covered pieces of a small aircraft. "Single-engine Cessna, 2 fatalities. It's already in our database." Reynolds examined the wreckage with a frown, then turned to Mike and the other parents. "I'm sorry," he said simply. The devastation on their faces mirrored his own disappointment. The return flight passed in desolate silence. Upon landing, Mike faced the impossible task of relaying the news to the waiting families at Westfield. The collective deflation was palpable as he explained the false alarm, the brief spark of hope extinguished as quickly as it had ignited. Jennifer collapsed into the arms of a crisis counselor upon hearing the news, her first emotional response after days of shock-induced calm. In the command center, Reynolds reorganized search grids on large topographical maps, expanding the perimeter to 40,000 square kilometers. Reports of potential debris sightings continued to flood in hourly, each requiring verification, each consuming precious resources. "We need to prioritize," Reynolds told his team. "Any report matching our aircraft's coloration or approximate size gets immediate helicopter recon. Everything else goes into the secondary queue." Outside the school, a media village had sprung up virtually overnight. News vans with satellite dishes crowded the parking lot, reporters jockeying for position to capture footage of grieving families. Tabloid headlines emerged with sensationalist theories: "Mystery in the mountains, champion children vanish without a trace," and "Was Flight 1742 hijacked? Experts question lack of wreckage." In a downtown Minneapolis law office, 7 families gathered around a conference table while attorneys explained potential litigation against Northern Skies Airways. The company had a documented history of safety violations they never disclosed to passengers, explained Catherine Morris, a veteran aviation attorney. Their maintenance deferrals on the hydraulic system alone provide grounds for significant negligence claims. By the 5th day, the psychological impact on families began manifesting in distinct ways. Jennifer Dawson finally returned home briefly to shower and change clothes. Walking into the twins' bedroom, she stood frozen in the doorway before methodically straightening their beds, arranging their clothes in drawers, and setting out clean pajamas. "They'll need fresh clothes when they come home," she murmured to herself, organizing pairs of socks with obsessive precision. Across town, Robert Johnson had transformed his apartment into an investigation hub. Maps of the Rocky Mountains covered every wall, festooned with calculations of flight trajectories, weather patterns, and search grid overlays. His employer's calls went unanswered as he pored over topographical surveys, convinced the official search was missing something crucial. On the 6th day, the first major disagreement erupted among families in the gymnasium when Robert presented his alternative search theory. "Based on wind patterns and fuel reserves, we should be focusing here," he insisted, pointing to an area northwest of the official search zone. "The FBI is wasting resources in sectors that make no aeronautical sense." "The professionals know what they're doing," countered another father. "Creating confusion only hampers the efforts." The argument escalated until Reynolds intervened, agreeing to review Robert's calculations while emphasizing the methodical nature of the official search protocol. Later that evening, Reynolds received a preliminary report from the NTSB regarding Flight 1742. While the hydraulic system maintenance had indeed been deferred multiple times, investigators couldn't conclusively determine this would cause catastrophic failure without examining the actual wreckage. 1 week after the disappearance, the FBI director held a press conference announcing expanded operations, including additional military resources and advanced satellite technology. Television screens throughout the gymnasium showed images of search efforts: volunteer hikers combing mountain trails, firefighters rappelling into remote areas, and even self-proclaimed psychics offering their visions to desperate families. As darkness fell on the 7th night, the community gathered outside Westfield Elementary for a candlelight vigil. 52 candles burned in the gentle evening breeze, one for each person aboard Flight 1742. The children's choir sang "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" as parents, teachers, and neighbors stood in silent solidarity, their faces illuminated by flickering light. In the command center, Reynolds worked alone late into the night, reviewing every detail of the case for the 100th time. His phone rang, startling him in the silence. "Agent Reynolds," he answered, suppressing a yawn. "Sir, this is Dr. Keller at the FBI lab. We've analyzed the military radar data that was just declassified. The aircraft may have altered course more drastically than initially thought. We're sending the new vectors now." Reynolds hurriedly updated his maps, realizing with growing dread that search teams might have been focusing on the wrong area entirely. As he recalculated potential crash sites, his phone rang again. It was the FBI director informing him that the White House had just called. The September 11th terrorist attacks had just occurred, and all national security resources, including those dedicated to Flight 1742, would need to be immediately redirected. The morning of September 12th dawned gray and somber over Westfield Elementary. The gymnasium, once bustling with FBI agents, National Guard personnel, and search coordinators, stood nearly empty. Parents and family members clustered around televisions hastily mounted on wheeled carts, their faces illuminated by footage of smoke billowing from the Twin Towers. The unthinkable tragedy had pushed Flight 1742 off every headline, every broadcast, every news ticker. Agent Reynolds stood in the command center, now staffed by a skeleton crew. The room that had hummed with activity just 24 hours earlier now felt cavernous and abandoned. Maps with carefully plotted search grids remained pinned to the walls, suddenly relegated to secondary importance in a world forever changed. 80% of our resources are being redirected to national security concerns, Reynolds explained to his diminished team, unable to mask the regret in his voice. We'll need to be strategic with what remains. Search operations will continue, but with significantly reduced personnel and equipment. Mike Dawson pushed through the door, his unshaven face and rumpled clothing evidence of another sleepless night. Seeing the half-empty room, he froze momentarily before marching directly to Reynolds. So, our children simply don't matter anymore because something worse happened? Mike's voice cracked with barely contained rage and exhaustion. Reynolds met his gaze steadily. I understand your frustration, Mr. Dawson, but this isn't my decision. I've been authorized to maintain a core search team, and I promise you, we won't stop looking. Mike's shoulders sagged. 47 kids, Agent Reynolds. 47 kids who were invisible before they made it to that swimming competition, and now they're invisible again. That afternoon, the cafeteria tables at Westfield were pushed together as the newly formed STARS Committee held its first official meeting. 23 families were represented, with Mike reluctantly accepting the role of chairperson. We need to be realistic, Mike addressed the group, standing before a whiteboard where he'd written "Next Steps" in bold letters. Federal resources are being diverted. Media attention is gone. If we want the search to continue with any meaningful intensity, we need to take matters into our own hands. What about the insurance money? Suggested Carlos Mendez's father. We all have policies on our children. It's horrible to think about, but if we pool those resources... Jennifer Dawson sat silently at the edge of the group, her hands methodically folding and refolding a small blue towel with the Westfield swim team logo. The past week had transformed her from a vibrant, engaged mother into a hollow-eyed automaton moving through the motions of existence. 2 days later, Jennifer sat across from Dr. Emily Chen, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma. The doctor's office was deliberately calming, soft lighting, muted colors, comfortable furnishings, but Jennifer perched on the edge of her chair as if prepared to flee. The symptoms you're describing are consistent with obsessive-compulsive disorder triggered by severe trauma, Dr. Chen explained gently. The compulsive organization, the repeated checking, the rigid routines, they're all attempts to create order in a situation where you've experienced profound helplessness. She slid a prescription across the desk. This might help reduce the anxiety while we work through the underlying trauma. Jennifer stared at the paper without reaching for it. I can't take this. What if they call and need me? What if they're found and I'm too foggy to understand? I need to stay alert. Always alert. Across town, Robert Johnson sat at his kitchen table, the glow of his laptop illuminating his haggard face as he spoke via video chat with a retired NOAA meteorologist. The wind patterns on May 17th suggest a northwestern drift of any aircraft experiencing control issues, the meteorologist explained, manipulating weather maps on his screen. Combined with the terrain features, I'd focus search efforts here. He circled an area that Robert immediately added to his own maps. That's what I've been saying, Robert muttered, more to himself than his conversation partner. There's something everyone is missing. Outside the downtown headquarters of Northern Skies Airways, a small group of Flight 1742 families held handwritten signs bearing their children's photos as company executives exited the building carrying cardboard boxes. The airline had officially filed for bankruptcy, its reputation and finances decimated by the disaster and subsequent litigation. "Where is my daughter?" shouted Robert Johnson as a middle-aged executive hurried past, head down. "You cut corners on safety and now you're walking away." By October, the community had rallied to launch Keep the Search Alive, a fundraising initiative to finance private search expeditions. The school gymnasium, once again transformed, now hosted silent auctions, donation tables, and the first public appearance of the Stars Choir, friends of the missing children performing songs the swim team had loved. In the Dawson home, Mike had converted the garage into an operations center. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colorful pins, indicating areas searched and areas still targeted. A whiteboard listed volunteer names and schedules, while a cork bulletin board displayed satellite photos acquired through Robert's persistent efforts. Jennifer maintained a different kind of vigil. The twins' bedroom remained exactly as they had left it on the morning of May 17th, with beds made to perfection each day. Fresh clothes were laid out every evening, and their favorite breakfast cereals remained stocked in the pantry. "They'll need their special Christmas pajamas," Jennifer told Mike as December approached, carefully laying out matching sets decorated with snowmen. The first privately funded expedition departed in late November, a team of professional mountaineers and former military personnel equipped with specialized gear for winter conditions. Mike briefed them thoroughly, providing detailed maps with areas of interest based on Robert's new radar analysis. On Christmas Eve, Westfield Elementary hosted a memorial service where 52 stockings hung from the gymnasium wall, each bearing the name of a person from Flight 1742. Families placed gifts beneath them, toys, books, sports equipment, that would later be donated to underprivileged children in the community. As winter tightened its grip on the Rockies, making search operations nearly impossible, the legal battle intensified. Attorneys representing the families explained that Northern Skies' bankruptcy would complicate litigation, but wouldn't eliminate their ability to seek justice. In late January, Mike and Robert traveled to Washington, D.C., meeting with Minnesota's senior senator in his wood-paneled office. Their pleas for renewed federal resources were met with diplomatic sympathy, but little concrete support. "In the current post-9/11 climate, there are limitations to what we can authorize," the senator explained, not quite meeting their eyes. "But I assure you, you have my deepest sympathies." As spring approached in 2002, melting snow in the Rockies revealed previously inaccessible areas, briefly renewing hope as new volunteer teams prepared for the improved conditions. On what would have been Alicia's 10th birthday, Robert sat alone in his apartment, a store-bought cake with unlit candles centered on his kitchen table. He stared at the silent phone, willing it to ring with news, any news. When his doorbell sounded, he nearly tripped rushing to answer, finding Mike Dawson standing there with a folder of papers. "I've been interviewing local mountain residents," Mike said without preamble. "An old trapper remembers seeing something unusual that day. We might have a new lead." While months transformed into a year, and national attention remained firmly fixed on the aftermath of September 11th and the new war on terror, a small note in a local Wyoming newspaper almost went unnoticed. A hunter had found what appeared to be a piece of blue metal with the partial logo of Northern Skies in an area that, inexplicably, had never been included in the official searches. The small note in the Wyoming local newspaper might have disappeared forever into obscurity, if not for Carlos Mendez Sr., who had set up Google alerts for every conceivable keyword related to Flight 1742. The article, barely 3 paragraphs long, mentioned a hunter's discovery of aircraft debris possibly linked to the Northern Skies tragedy in a remote area south of Rawlins. Within hours, The clipping had been scanned, analyzed, and distributed to every member of the STARS committee. 5 years after the disappearance, on a crisp May morning in 2006, the newly inaugurated Westfield STARS Aquatic Memorial gleamed in the spring sunlight. The school's swimming pool had been completely renovated, its bottom adorned with 52 golden stars inlaid in the blue tile, each bearing the name of a passenger from Flight 1742. Mike Dawson stood at the poolside podium, his once dark hair now liberally streaked with gray, deep lines etched permanently around his eyes. The crowd before him was noticeably smaller than at previous anniversaries, about 60 people compared to the hundreds who had attended the first and second memorial services. 5 years ago today, Mike began, his voice steady despite the emotion visible on his face. We lost not just our children, but our belief in the systems meant to protect them and find them if the worst happened. We have not given up, and we will never give up until we bring them home. Across town in the Minneapolis FBI field office, Marcus Reynolds sat at his desk, walls now adorned with photos from other cases, kidnappings solved, fugitives captured, families reunited. Yet the Flight 1742 file remained in a special place on his bookshelf, its worn edges testament to how often he still reviewed its contents. When his phone rang with news about the metal fragment found by the Wyoming hunter, he immediately reached for the file. "Get me verification on this," Reynolds instructed the agent on the other end. "And contact Dr. Abrams at the forensics lab. I want her team on standby if this is consistent with our aircraft." In the sterile environment of the FBI laboratory, technicians carefully examined the blue metal fragment bearing the partial Northern Skies logo. Under powerful microscopes, they compared paint samples to the airline's specifications, while material analysts assessed the composition of the metal itself. Preliminary findings suggest this is consistent with the exterior fuselage paint from an Embraer ERJ-145, the lead technician reported. The weathering patterns indicate exposure to elements for approximately 5 years. Jennifer Dawson was organizing materials for her grief counseling group when the call came. She had reinvented herself as a counselor for families of missing persons, channeling her unresolved grief into helping others navigate similar trauma. Her hands trembled as she held the phone, listening to Mike's breathless explanation about the fragment. "They think it's from the plane, Jen," Mike said, his voice cracking slightly. "They're assembling a search team. I'm flying to Wyoming tomorrow morning." 3 days later, a specialized search team including Robert Johnson and several volunteer experts arrived at the remote location where the fragment had been discovered. Equipped with advanced GPS devices and metal detectors, they methodically began scanning the rugged terrain. "We'll work in a grid pattern," Reynolds instructed, personally overseeing the operation despite nearing retirement age. 10-foot intervals, mark anything unusual with the red flags. Hour after hour, the search party combed through underbrush and rocky outcroppings. Hope flared briefly when one of the metal detectors gave a strong signal, prompting careful excavation of the site. The team worked with painstaking precision, removing dirt layer by layer until the object was revealed. A geologist examining the uncovered metal piece shook his head slowly. "This is from an abandoned weather station," he explained, pointing to distinctive markings beneath the weathered blue paint. These stations were common in this region during the 70s. The similar blue color and weathering created the illusion of the airline logo. Robert Johnson stared at the piece of metal, his body beginning to tremble uncontrollably. After 5 years of hope, calculations, and theories, this latest disappointment proved unbearable. He fell to his knees, face turned skyward, and released a primal scream that echoed through the canyon, startling birds from nearby trees. 2 other team members rushed to restrain Robert as he began throwing rocks and tearing at the ground with his bare hands. 5 years, he shouted between sobs. 5 fucking years, and we're still finding nothing. Back in Minneapolis, the news of another false lead hit Jennifer Dawson with devastating force. After so many disappointments, this one, which had seemed so promising, broke something fundamental within her. Mike found the twins' backpacks arranged carefully on their beds when he returned home that evening, alongside an empty bottle of sleeping pills. The paramedics barely reached Jennifer in time. 3 weeks later, a group therapy session for Flight 1742 families revealed the growing divide between those determined to continue searching and those beginning to contemplate acceptance. "I've missed 5 years of my life," said Maria Gonzalez, mother of swimmer Lucia. "My other children are growing up with a ghost for a mother. At some point, we have to acknowledge reality." "Acceptance isn't abandonment," the therapist explained gently. "What you're experiencing is called ambiguous loss, grief without closure, which makes it particularly difficult to process." In a studio apartment cluttered with production equipment, a Netflix documentary crew interviewed Mike for 47, Missing in the Heights. The cameras captured his garage command center, now significantly reduced but still meticulously maintained. "People ask why we keep searching after 5 years," Mike told the filmmaker. "Would you stop looking for your children? Ever?" Online forums dedicated to the case had proliferated, ranging from thoughtful analysis to wild conspiracy theories involving alien abduction and secret government programs. Some family members participated anonymously, finding both comfort and pain in the continued interest in their children's fate. In Washington, D.C., Mike and Reynolds testified before a congressional hearing on the Search and Rescue Reform Act, inspired by Flight 1742's case. Their testimony highlighted the critical gaps in protocols that had hampered the original search efforts. On the eve of what would have been Alicia Johnson's 15th birthday, Robert finally agreed to hold a memorial service instead of planning another search expedition, accepting that he might never find his daughter, unaware that, over 1,000 miles away, a Labrador named Rex was obsessively digging in a boggy field on Frank Whitman's remote Wyoming property, intrigued by something buried deep in the dark mud. The Labrador's obsessive digging continued day after day, much to Frank Whitman's growing curiosity. The 67-year-old farmer had owned his Wyoming property for nearly 4 decades, but he'd always avoided the marshy section where Rex now fixated. The dog would sprint to the same spot each morning, pawing frantically at the dark soil, as if his life depended on it. "Probably just a gopher or something," Frank muttered to himself on the 3rd consecutive morning of Rex's strange behavior. The spring sun warmed his weathered face as he leaned against his pickup truck, watching the dog from a distance. Something about the animal's persistence finally overcame Frank's indifference. Setting down his coffee mug on the truck's hood, he trudged across the field toward Rex, boots squelching in the soggy earth. As he approached, the dog looked up briefly, tail wagging excitedly before resuming his determined excavation. "What have you got there, boy?" Frank asked, kneeling beside the muddy hole despite his arthritic knees protesting the movement. Rex had unearthed something small and red, partially visible in the dark soil. Frank initially dismissed it as a piece of plastic trash, perhaps blown onto his property from the highway 5 miles distant. Reaching into the mud, Frank extracted the object and wiped away the clinging soil with his thumb. It wasn't plastic garbage at all, but a small athletic shoe. A child's sneaker, its once bright red color dulled by years of burial in the acidic bog. The item felt strangely out of place in these remote acres where human visitors were rare. Frank turned the small shoe over in his calloused hands, preparing to toss it aside when something caught his eye. On the inside collar, handwritten in faded but still legible blue marker, were the initials TD. The personalized marking struck him as oddly familiar, triggering a distant memory he couldn't quite place. Back at his modest farmhouse, Frank rinsed the mud from the sneaker with a garden hose, revealing more details, a distinctive tread pattern, and small stars embossed on the sides. Something about the shoe nagged at his memory. Settling at his kitchen table with the cleaned sneaker, he powered up his aging desktop computer. "Missing children red sneakers," Frank typed into the search engine, waiting patiently as his slow internet connection processed the request. The results loaded gradually, and his blood ran cold as he scrolled through images of the Westfield Elementary swim team, all 47 children wearing identical red sneakers in their team photo. The next morning, Frank placed the sneaker in a plastic sandwich bag and drove the 30 minutes to the Rawlins County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Melissa Torres glanced up from her paperwork as the farmer approached her desk, plastic bag in hand. "Found something strange on my property," Frank explained, setting the bag on her desk. "My dog dug it up, thought it might be important." Torres took cursory notes about the location and Frank's contact information, her expression suggesting she'd file the report but didn't expect it to lead anywhere. "We'll look into it, Mr. Whitman," she assured him mechanically. 2 days later, frustrated by the lack of follow-up, Frank returned to the sheriff's office with the sneaker, this time catching Deputy Torres alone at her desk. "Mind if I have another look at that?" she asked, curiosity finally piqued by Frank's persistence. Torres slipped on latex gloves before removing the sneaker from the bag. "It looks like it's been buried for years," she observed, turning it over carefully. The initials caught her attention. Torres swiveled to her computer and quickly searched for TD Missing Child Red Sneaker. The search results connected immediately to Flight 1742 and specifically to Tyler Dawson, one of the twin boys who had disappeared. "Mr. Whitman," Torres said slowly, "where exactly did your dog find this?" Despite finally recognizing the potential significance, Sheriff Richard Combs remained skeptical when Torres brought him the information. "That area was searched twice," Combs insisted, leaning back in his creaking office chair. "Once in 2001 and again in 2003. We can't reopen wounds based on a single shoe that could have gotten there 100 different ways." Torres frowned, unconvinced by her superior's dismissal. "With all due respect, sir, these families have been searching for closure for 5 years. Don't they deserve to know?" "Write it up if you want," Combs relented with a sigh, "but don't contact the FBI. Last thing we need is federal agents trampling all over our jurisdiction for another false alarm." Later that evening, Torres sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the photographs she'd taken of the sneaker. Against direct orders, she composed an email to Marcus Reynolds, whose contact information she'd found through online articles about the case. She attached the photos and precise GPS coordinates of Frank's property, then hesitated only briefly before clicking send. The news spread through the Flight 1742 families like wildfire, breaking first on social media before any official announcement. Mike Dawson was mid-sentence during an aviation safety lecture in Seattle when his phone began vibrating relentlessly in his pocket. Stepping off the podium with a hurried apology, he checked the flood of messages and saw the image of a small red sneaker with his son's initials clearly visible inside. "It's his," Mike confirmed in a choked voice when he called Jennifer. "It's Tyler's shoe. I recognize your handwriting on the initials." The FBI's initial reluctance to reopen the investigation sparked immediate backlash. Internal documents later revealed through a Freedom of Information Act request showed the agency's hesitation stemmed from institutional embarrassment. How do we explain not finding an entire aircraft with 52 people less than 20 miles from the projected flight path? Questioned an internal memo from the Denver field office supervisor. Public pressure mounted rapidly, however, forcing the FBI to assemble a multidisciplinary team. 1 week after the sneaker's discovery, geologists, human remains recovery specialists, and aircraft accident investigators established a perimeter around the boggy area of Frank Whitman's property. The initial days of investigation proved frustrating. The unstable soil, composed of peat and clay, made conventional excavation nearly impossible. It wasn't until the team brought in ground-penetrating radar, technology that didn't exist during the original searches, that the truth began to emerge. "We have a substantial anomaly approximately 15 meters below the surface," announced Dr. Eliza Warner, a geophysicist examining the radar readings. "An extensive metallic structure, buried vertically." While the sun set over the excavation operation, technicians recovered what initially appeared to be degraded yellow fabric pieces near the upper part of the fuselage, until a veteran investigator realized the terrible truth. They were the remains of the improvised flags Sarah had mentioned in her diary, raised through openings in the roof while the children desperately waved for help exactly in the area the first search helicopters had flown over 20 years ago. The yellow fabric remnants sent a chill through the excavation team. What they had initially dismissed as degraded material was unmistakably man-made. Tattered pieces of the Westfield swim team uniforms, fashioned into desperate signals for help. The veteran investigator who made the connection stood motionless, his weathered face ashen as he realized the implications. "These are the flags," he whispered to Dr. Warner. "The ones Sarah mentioned in her journal. They were alive down there, waving for help." As dawn broke the following day, the excavation site transformed into a hive of specialized activity. White tents housing scientific equipment surrounded the boggy area, with generators humming steadily in the background. Government vehicles with FBI and NTSB markings lined the narrow access road to Frank Whitman's property, transforming the remote farmland into a makeshift research station. Dr. Eliza Warner gathered the team leaders near the main monitoring station, pointing to three-dimensional renderings on high-resolution screens. The ground-penetrating radar had produced remarkably clear images overnight, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of an Embraer ERJ-145 aircraft in an almost vertical position. "What we're seeing is extraordinary," Warner explained, adjusting her glasses as she addressed FBI agents and the first family members who had arrived. "The aircraft appears intact, preserved in an anaerobic environment created by the unique soil composition. This peat bog essentially created a natural time capsule." Recovery engineers huddled nearby, debating the immense technical challenges they faced. "Standard extraction methods won't work here," argued the lead engineer, pointing to soil density readings. "The suction effect from the surrounding peat could tear the fuselage apart if we attempt to pull it straight up." "Every centimeter we disturb could destroy evidence," another added. "We need to treat this more like an archaeological excavation than a typical crash recovery." Jennifer and Mike Dawson arrived that afternoon, their rental car kicking up dust as it approached the police barricade. Reynolds met them personally, his face betraying the emotional weight of the moment. When he presented Jennifer with the evidence box containing Tyler's cleaned and preserved red sneaker, she dropped to her knees, cradling the small shoe in trembling hands. "I wrote his initials the morning they left," she whispered, tracing the faded letters with her fingertip. "He was so excited, he kept putting on the wrong shoe." Robert Johnson arrived hours later, his face gaunt and eyes hollow from 20 years of obsessive searching. He immediately confronted the FBI team supervising the recovery operation. "You've already failed once with our children," he shouted, pointing accusingly at the lead agent. "I want full transparency on every decision being made here. No shortcuts, no bureaucratic cover-ups." On the third day of excavation, a specialized crane designed for archaeological digs carefully raised the first substantial component from the earth. A section of the aircraft's tail, the blue paint, and partial Northern Skies logo, still visible beneath layers of clay and organic matter. Gasps echoed across the site as the reality of what lay beneath their feet became tangible. Dr. Warner arranged an impromptu press conference, explaining the remarkable geological phenomenon to the assembled journalists. "What we're witnessing is an extremely rare case of burial by impact in saturated soil. The aircraft descended almost vertically into this specific bog, whose unique composition, a mixture of peat, clay, and acidic water, allowed it to sink rapidly and be preserved rather than destroyed. As additional family members arrived at the site, they established a makeshift memorial along the perimeter of the excavation area. Photos of loved ones, flowers, stuffed animals, and personal mementos transformed the scientific operation into a sacred space of remembrance. Some families conducted private prayers and rituals, finding comfort in finally being close to their lost children. Tensions flared on the fifth day when discussion turned to the ownership of recovered personal items. Several parents demanded immediate return of their children's belongings, while FBI officials insisted everything constituted evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. "These aren't just items," argued Carlos Mendez Sr., his voice breaking. "These are the last things our children touched. They belong with their families, not in some evidence warehouse." As the seventh day of recovery operations began, a team wearing specialized protective suits entered the partially excavated area. Working with extraordinary care, they retrieved a blue waterproof backpack that had remained remarkably well preserved in the anaerobic conditions. A forensic technician opened the backpack in a controlled environment tent, revealing a spiral-bound notebook with a blue cover, Sarah Miller's diary. The discovery sent immediate ripples through the investigation team, with several technicians visibly affected by the implications. Reynolds, wearing protective gloves, carefully turned the pages of the recovered diary, his expression hardening as he read entries dated after the reported time of disappearance. He immediately contacted FBI headquarters, requesting additional personnel for what was quickly becoming one of the most sensitive recovery operations in Bureau history. Jennifer sat between Mike and Robert in the family briefing tent, silent tears streaming down her face as Reynolds read selected passages from Sarah's diary. The entry describing how Tyler had survived the impact, being cared for by assistant coach Tiffany despite his injured leg, was almost unbearable to hear. "They were alive," Jennifer whispered, clutching Mike's hand. "Our boys were alive down there." The last page of the diary, read aloud by Reynolds in a voice struggling for professional detachment, left everyone in stunned silence. "I want them to know we did everything we could, and that they were brave until the end." While the sun set over the excavation operation, technicians recovered what initially appeared to be degraded yellow fabric pieces near the upper part of the fuselage, until a veteran investigator realized the terrible truth. They were the remains of the improvised flags Sarah had mentioned in her diary, raised through openings in the roof while the children desperately waved for help, exactly in the area the first search helicopters had flown over 20 years ago. The yellow fabric fragments told a story more heartbreaking than anyone had prepared for. Children desperately signaling for help while search helicopters flew overhead, never seeing what lay beneath the deceptive surface of the bog. The recovery team worked through the night under powerful floodlights, their faces grim as they carefully documented each new discovery. In the mobile laboratory established on Frank Whitman's property, forensic specialists meticulously cataloged every item retrieved from the aircraft. The preservation quality was unprecedented, allowing them to establish a detailed chronology based on the location of bodies within the fuselage and the personal effects surrounding them. Dr. Catherine Reeves, the lead forensic pathologist, met with Jennifer and Mike Dawson in a quiet corner of the family briefing tent early the next morning. Her compassionate professionalism couldn't soften the devastating information she needed to share. "Based on our preliminary examination," Dr. Reeves explained gently, "Tyler survived the initial impact with injuries to his lower leg. The evidence suggests he likely succumbed to hypothermia approximately 48 hours after the crash." Jennifer nodded silently, having already suspected as much from Sarah's diary entries. Mike stared blankly at the ground, his mind still struggling to process that his son had been alive, waiting for rescue that never came. Later that afternoon, excavation teams recovered a bundle secured with a faded blue ribbon from near the midsection of the aircraft. Inside were dozens of small cards, final messages written by the children during their last hours. Jennifer recognized the twins' handwriting immediately, her hands trembling as she read Tyler's message aloud. "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry I'm not coming home. Coach Sarah told us to be brave like champions. I'm trying. Love you. Take care of Max for me." The box of recovered letters was placed in a climate-controlled evidence container, but not before photographs were taken for the families. Each message revealed the extraordinary courage of children facing unimaginable circumstances, guided by coaches who had done everything possible to comfort and organize them in their final hours. 3 days later, NTSB engineers successfully recovered both flight recorders, remarkably well preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the peat bog. Analysis began immediately, with preliminary data confirming what Sarah's diary had suggested, a catastrophic hydraulic failure during severe turbulence, compounded by the captain's decision to fly through the storm rather than divert around it. The data shows Captain Harmon attempting to maintain his flight plan despite deteriorating weather conditions, explained the NTSB's lead investigator during a briefing. When the hydraulic system began failing, likely due to deferred maintenance issues, they were too deep into the storm cell for effective emergency procedures. The digital reconstruction of the flight's final minutes displayed on high-definition screens showed the aircraft's desperate struggle, dropping rapidly before the pilots temporarily regained partial control, only to lose it completely in the final moments. Robert Johnson's interview with CNN became national news, his raw emotion capturing the outrage felt by many families. "My daughter was less than 30 kilometers from the projected flight path," he said, his voice breaking. "They survived for days. How is it possible that we didn't find them?" A tense meeting at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. revealed growing concern about legal liability. Senior officials discussed the implications of the recovery operation findings, with one assistant attorney general warning about the storm of lawsuits that's coming. Back at the excavation site, geologists and search and rescue specialists analyzed topographical maps, attempting to understand how the aircraft had remained undetected for so long. "It's such an improbable geological coincidence," explained Dr. Warner, pointing to soil density readings. "Even if we had searched exactly the right location, without the equipment we have today, we probably wouldn't have detected the aircraft at this depth." The makeshift memorial at the entrance to Frank Whitman's farm grew exponentially as news of the recovery spread. People from across the country made pilgrimages to leave flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten messages. Some visitors brought their own red sneakers, identical to those worn by the victims, placing them reverently among the tributes. Jennifer Dawson met with her longtime therapist via video call from her hotel room near the recovery site, attempting to process her conflicting emotions. "For 20 years, I imagined them alive somewhere," she confessed, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Now I know they were gone all along, but somehow that hurts less than not knowing." Frank Whitman reluctantly agreed to a single interview, uncomfortable with the sudden attention thrust upon him and his property. Standing beside the barn where he'd stored farm equipment for decades, he spoke quietly to a PBS documentary crew. "Sometimes I think I didn't find them," he reflected, watching wrecks play in the distance. "They found me when we were ready to hear their story." Reynolds, now serving as an official consultant to the investigation, spent hours examining the original search maps from 2001. He identified the critical failure in methodology that had allowed the aircraft to remain hidden for 2 decades. The assumption that an aircraft of this size would be easily visible from the air led to insufficient scrutiny of areas where it could be completely concealed, he explained to the investigation team. "We never considered that an intact aircraft could disappear so completely beneath the surface." On a quiet afternoon as the excavation continued, forensic technicians recovered a regional medal still clutched in Alicia Johnson's preserved hand. When Robert held it for the first time in 20 years, the stoic facade he had maintained throughout the recovery process finally crumbled. Surrounded by other parents who understood his pain like no one else could, he allowed himself to weep openly for the daughter he had never stopped searching for. While the recovery operation approached its conclusion, a unanimous decision was made by the families, announced by Mike Dawson at an emotional press conference. The 52 victims of Flight 1742 would be buried together at the newly conceived Westfield Stars Memorial, exactly as they had been in their final moments, united as a family that fought bravely until the end. The decision to bury the 52 victims together reflected a profound truth. They had faced their final moments as a family, bound by circumstance and courage. In the year following the discovery, the transformation of Westfield Elementary was remarkable. The school's swimming pool, once the training ground for championship dreams, had been converted into a circular memorial. 52 bronze stars were embedded in the floor, each bearing the name of a victim, arranged in the same seating pattern they had occupied on Flight 1742. Construction workers applied the finishing touches to the memorial as May approached. A central bronze sculpture depicted a pair of the iconic red sneakers, perfectly captured in mid-stride, symbolizing journeys interrupted yet eternally remembered. Soft lighting illuminated the space, creating an atmosphere of reverence rather than mourning. In the new natatorium built adjacent to the memorial, Jennifer Dawson adjusted a young swimmer's form in the water. After 20 years of searching, she had found her purpose in coaching the next generation of Westfield swimmers. A discreet photo of the twins adorned her staff badge, their smiling faces frozen in time, yet somehow present in every lesson she taught. "Remember to breathe every third stroke," she instructed a girl struggling with her freestyle technique. "Find your rhythm and trust it." Miles away in Washington, D.C., Mike Dawson testified before a congressional committee on the Westfield STARS Act, comprehensive legislation establishing stringent standards for search and rescue operations across diverse terrains. His testimony, delivered with the quiet authority of someone intimately acquainted with systematic failure, silenced the usually restless chamber. 20 years ago, we lacked the technology and methodology to find what was hidden from view, he explained, gestures emphasizing his points. But we also lacked the imagination to consider that our assumptions could be catastrophically wrong. This legislation ensures we never make the same mistakes again. At a crowded bookstore in Minneapolis, Robert Johnson signed copies of 3 Days in the Depths, The Final Voices of Flight 1742. The compilation of Sarah Miller's diary and the children's letters had become required reading in schools nationwide, teaching resilience and compassion through the unvarnished truth of the tragedy. "Your daughter's letter helped my son understand what true courage means," a woman told Robert, clutching the book to her chest. "Thank you for sharing these stories with the world," Robert nodded, the gratitude still feeling strange after decades of anger. The book had given Alicia's short life an impact far beyond anything he could have imagined, touching millions with her simple final words. At the FBI Academy in Quantico, Reynolds stood before a class of recruits, using the Flight 1742 case study to illustrate fundamental principles of investigation. "Never presume, never give up, never underestimate the terrain," he emphasized, his once dark hair now completely silver. "These children deserved better from us, and their legacy is the improvements we've made to ensure such oversights never happen again." Frank Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his suit as he and Rex received an honorary plaque from the National Search and Rescue Association. The elderly farmer's weathered face flushed at the standing ovation, his discomfort with attention evident. "My dog deserves all the credit," he insisted when finally coaxed to the microphone. "I just followed where he led." In homes across Minneapolis and beyond, families carefully placed recovered personal belongings in special displays. Jennifer positioned the twins' restored sneakers in a custom glass case, alongside their competition medals and the letters they had written in their final hours. These artifacts, once evidence in a federal investigation, had finally come home. Different families found unique ways to honor their lost children. The Mendez family established a scholarship for disadvantaged swimmers. The Wilsons created a foundation advocating for transportation safety reforms. The Johnsons funded research into advanced search technologies. Each initiative transformed grief into purpose, ensuring the tragedy catalyzed positive change. At a scientific conference in Denver, Dr. Warner presented her findings on the unique preservation phenomenon that had occurred in the Wyoming bog. "This case has revolutionized our understanding of how we search for wreckage in various environments," she explained to colleagues. "The technology developed specifically for this recovery operation is now being deployed globally." At the Colorado Search and Rescue Training Center, instructors taught new protocols explicitly based on lessons from Flight 1742. "Assumptions killed these children a second time," the lead trainer explained to his class. We now search with multiple methodologies simultaneously, including ground-penetrating radar in areas previously considered improbable. On the morning of the memorial service, the streets of Minneapolis filled with mourners from across the country. Many carried small paper red sneakers, the symbol that had come to represent both the tragedy and the renewed commitment to never abandon the search for answers. 52 identical urns lined the Westfield Stars Memorial, each draped with an American flag and topped with a folded yellow and blue swim team uniform. Mike Dawson, his hair now completely gray, addressed the gathered crowd and the millions watching via live stream. "For 20 years I asked why they weren't found," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the perfect acoustics of the memorial. "Now I ask why we didn't search better, and that's the question our nation will need to answer for all families still waiting for closure." After the ceremony, Jennifer stood alone in the new natatorium, watching light reflect off the water's surface. A documentary filmmaker had asked how she coped with the definitive loss of hope that her children might somehow still be alive. "They didn't grow up," Jennifer explained, her reflection rippling in the pool. "But they're not missing anymore either. They're here, finally found. And that's something many families never get." On the last day of school before summer, exactly 21 years after Flight 1742 disappeared, a new generation of young Westfield swimmers gathered around the Stars Memorial, each wearing the team's red sneakers, listening as Jennifer Dawson told them about the children who came before them, and learning that Sarah Miller's final diary entry, now inscribed in bronze on the memorial, had become not just an epitaph, but a national motto about never giving up the search for answers. "I want them to know we did everything we could and that they were brave until the end,"